Beethoven learned to play the piano from Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier. He learned it as a child, before he wrote anything of his own, and he returned to it throughout his life. When someone called Bach's name, Bach means brook in German, Beethoven reportedly said, not a brook. An ocean. He should have been called Ocean. This was not a casual compliment from one great composer to another. It was a statement about scale. Bach's music contains more than any other music contains. More counterpoint, more harmonic invention, more structural complexity, more emotional depth within formally constrained space. 2.5 centuries after his death, musicians are still discovering things in it that weren't seen before. Johann Sebastian Bach was born on March 21, 1685, in the small German town of Eisenach in Thuringia, and died on July 28, 1750, in Leipzig. Between those dates he held a series of modest church and court positions, raised 20 children. 7 with his first wife, 13 with his second, argued with employers, spent a month in jail for resigning too forcefully, and wrote more than 1,000 pieces of music. He was not particularly famous in his lifetime as a composer. He was famous as an organist. The music, for the most part, sat in drawers and archives, copied out by hand, circulated in small communities of musicians who understood what they were looking at. The rest of the world did not find out for another century. The notebook behind the lattice door. Bach was orphaned at 10. His mother died in 1694, his father less than a year later, and the boy was taken in by his older brother Johann Christoph, who was an organist in the nearby town of Ohrdruf and had studied with Johann Pachelbel. Johann Christoph gave his younger brother a solid musical education, keyboard technique, figured bass, the rudiments of composition. And also possessed a manuscript notebook filled with pieces by the leading composers of the era, Pachelbel, Buxtehude, Froberger, others. He considered these pieces either too advanced or too precious for a child, and kept the notebook locked in a cabinet with a lattice door. Sebastian could see through the lattice. At night, when Johann Christoph was asleep, he would reach through the gaps in the woodwork, pull the notebook out, and by moonlight, there was no other light he dared use. Copy the pieces out by hand onto his own paper. He did this over many months, working in darkness by the light that came through the windows, until he had transcribed the entire book. When Johann Christoph discovered what had happened, he confiscated the copies. Sebastian had already absorbed the music. The months of work in poor light, historians have suggested, were a significant contribution to the eye problems that would eventually leave him blind at the end of his life. He copied music by moonlight as a child and spent his final years unable to see the music he was writing. The walk to Lübeck. At 15, Bach left Ohrdruf on foot with a school friend named George Erdmann, walking north to Lüneburg, a distance of more than 300 kilometers, to take up a position as a chorister at the school attached to St. Michael's Church. The walk was the first of several journeys Bach made specifically to hear music he could not otherwise encounter. The school had an excellent library and an organ. Lüneburg was within reasonable distance of Hamburg and Celle, where French instrumental music was being cultivated at court, and Hamburg was close enough for occasional visits. Most significantly, Lübeck was roughly 100 kilometers from Lüneburg, and in Lübeck worked Dietrich Buxtehude, the greatest organist in northern Germany and one of the most important composers alive. In 1705, Bach was given a month's leave from his post in Arnstadt to travel to Lübeck and hear Buxtehude play. He stayed 4 months. When he returned, his playing had changed in ways his employers found alarming. He was inserting unusual harmonies into the chorale preludes during services, harmonies that confused the congregation, and his sense of time had loosened into something more improvisatory and exploratory than the post required. He was censured. He ignored the censure and kept playing. The month in jail and the move to Köthen. Bach's relationship with employers was consistently difficult. He had high standards, strong opinions, and limited patience for institutional mediocrity. In Arnstadt he clashed with the church council over the choir's incompetence and his own harmonic experiments. In Mulhausen he found the theological atmosphere uncongenial and left after a year. In Weimar, where he served as court organist and later concertmaster for the Duke Wilhelm Ernst, the situation developed into open conflict when the Duke passed him over for promotion to Kapellmeister, appointing another candidate instead. Bach responded by resigning. The Duke responded by refusing to accept the resignation. Bach insisted. The Duke had him arrested and held in the court jail for 4 weeks, for too stubbornly forcing the issue of his dismissal. Bach was released in disgrace and left Weimar with what the court records describe as an unfavorable discharge. He was immediately appointed Kapellmeister at the court of Prince Leopold of Anhalt-Köthen, where the conditions were about as close to ideal as Bach would encounter anywhere: an enthusiastic patron who played music himself, a good ensemble, and a reformed Protestant court that did not require elaborate sacred music, leaving Bach free to concentrate on instrumental composition. The Köthen years produced a concentration of instrumental masterworks that has no parallel in Bach's output. The 6 Brandenburg Concertos, dedicated to the Margrave of Brandenburg-Schwedt, are an encyclopedia of Baroque orchestral style. Each concerto uses a different combination of instruments, each has a different character, and together they exhaust the formal possibilities of the genre in a way that left later composers little to add. The first volume of the Well-Tempered Clavier, 24 preludes and fugues in all 24 major and minor keys, one for each, demonstrated the possibilities of equal temperament and became the foundational text of keyboard music. The sonatas and partitas for solo violin, and the suites for solo cello, remain among the most demanding and most studied works in the repertoire for those instruments. In 1720, while Bach was traveling with Prince Leopold, his first wife Maria Barbara died suddenly. He returned to find her already buried, the children motherless. A year later he married Anna Magdalena Wilke, a young soprano who had been employed at the court, and who became not only his wife and the mother of 13 of his children but his copyist, his musical collaborator, and the person who kept the household functioning through the decades of intense compositional activity that followed. Leipzig, the Cantata Factory and the Passions. In 1723, Bach was appointed cantor of the Thomaskirche in Leipzig, not as the first choice for the position, since Telemann and Graupner had both been offered the job and declined it, but as the third choice, a fact the Leipzig authorities apparently mentioned to him and that he apparently absorbed with the composure of a man who had learned not to expect institutions to recognize what they had. He stayed in Leipzig for 27 years, until his death. The job was enormous. He was responsible for the music at 4 churches, for teaching Latin and music to the boys of the Thomaskule, and for providing new music for each Sunday and feast day throughout the liturgical year. In his first years in Leipzig, this meant composing a new cantata every week, a substantial choral and orchestral work on a biblical text, typically lasting 20 to 30 minutes. While simultaneously managing the choir, directing performances, teaching, and handling the administrative demands of the school. He produced roughly 300 cantatas in Leipzig, approximately 200 of which survive. Alongside this sustained weekly output, he wrote the large-scale works on which his reputation now primarily rests. The St. John Passion, first performed in 1724, sets the account of Christ's death from the Gospel of John with a dramatic compression that matches the source text's intensity. The St. Matthew Passion, performed in 1727, is something else entirely. A work of nearly 3 hours for double chorus and double orchestra, setting the Passion narrative from Matthew with a depth of human feeling and a scale of musical architecture that has led musicians across 3 centuries to call it the greatest single work of Western music. The Mass in B minor, assembled over decades and completed in the final years of Bach's life, synthesizes the entire history of sacred polyphony from the Renaissance through the Baroque in a work of such comprehensive ambition that it has no precise parallel in the repertoire. The St. Matthew Passion, Lost and Found. After Bach's death in 1750, the St. Matthew Passion disappeared. It had been performed in Leipzig in 1727 and possibly again in 1729 and 1736, and then it vanished into the manuscripts that were divided among Bach's sons. For nearly 80 years, it was essentially unknown to anyone outside a small circle of specialists. The manuscript copy in Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach's possession was eventually acquired by the Berlin Singakademie, where it sat in the archive while the musical world moved on to Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, and the music of the Baroque receded into what most people assumed was permanent irrelevance. In 1823, the 16-year-old Felix Mendelssohn received a copy of the score as a Christmas gift from his grandmother. He spent the next 6 years studying it. In March 1829, at the age of 20, he conducted the first public performance of the Street Matthew Passion since Bach's lifetime, in Berlin, before an audience that included Hegel and a packed house that had to be turned away in the hundreds. The event caused a sensation. Mendelssohn had to conduct a second performance 2 weeks later. A third was organized. The music that had been sitting in an archive for nearly a century was suddenly being recognized as one of the foundational works of Western civilization, and the man who had written it, dead for 79 years, largely forgotten as a composer if not as an organist, was being reassessed as the figure Beethoven had called an ocean. The Bach revival that followed was systematic and comprehensive. In 1850, the Bach-Gesellschaft was founded with the explicit purpose of locating, editing, and publishing Bach's complete works, a project that took 46 years. The catalog system developed for the project, using BWV numbers to identify each work, is still the standard reference. What emerged from the archives was a body of work so large and so varied that musicians and scholars are still working through its implications. The Royal Theme and the Art of Fugue. In 1747, Bach traveled to Potsdam at the invitation of Frederick the Great of Prussia, who was an amateur flutist and an admirer of the new Galant style that Bach's own sons were helping to develop, a style that was, in some respects, the antithesis of everything Bach had spent his life perfecting. Frederick gave Bach a long, elaborate chromatic theme and asked him to improvise a fugue on it. Bach improvised a 3-voice fugue immediately. Frederick asked for one in 6 voices. A request of extreme difficulty, since not all themes are capable of sustaining 6-voice counterpoint. Bach chose his own theme for the 6-voice version, explaining that the royal theme did not lend itself to the exercise. He returned to Leipzig and worked the royal theme into a comprehensive set of canons and fugues, the musical offering, which he had printed and sent to Frederick. Whether Frederick ever looked at it is not recorded. The work is now considered one of the supreme examples of Bach's late contrapuntal thinking, and the royal theme that Frederick provided turns out to be, under Bach's hands, extraordinarily fertile. He found in it possibilities that Frederick, who had chosen it as a deliberate challenge, had not imagined were there. The last major project of Bach's life was the Art of Fugue. A systematic exploration of all the contrapuntal possibilities of a single theme, written without specifying any instrument or ensemble. It is music as pure thought, the relationships between voices, the inversions and augmentations and stretto entries, the combinations of multiple themes. All of it drawn from a single melodic idea and developed with a rigor and a completeness that treats counterpoint not as a compositional technique but as a way of investigating the mathematical structure underlying musical sound. Bach did not finish it. The final fugue breaks off in the middle of a section where he was combining 3 themes with a new 4th theme built on the notes Bach, his own name, in German musical notation, when he apparently could no longer work. He was blind. He died on July 28, 1750. The fugue was published with a note from his son that it had been left incomplete at the composer's death. The Voyager and the Ocean. In 1977, NASA launched the Voyager spacecraft with a golden record aboard, a disc containing sounds and music intended to represent human civilization to any extraterrestrial intelligence that might eventually find it. The committee that selected the music included, among other things, 3 Bach pieces. The Prelude and Fugue in C major from the Well-Tempered Clavier, the Second Brandenburg Concerto, and the Gavotte from the Partita No. 3 for solo violin. The committee member Carl Sagan reportedly said that there had been some debate about whether to include so much Bach, it might seem like showing off. It is difficult to imagine a more precise measure of what Bach's music means than the fact that when human beings had to choose what to send into infinite space as evidence of what we are capable of, they chose more of his music than any other composer's. Not because it is the most immediately accessible, or the most popular, or the most emotionally direct. Because it is the thing that is hardest to explain as the product of a single human mind working in a single human lifetime, and that therefore most fully demonstrates what a human mind can do. Beethoven called him an ocean. The Voyager is now more than 20 billion kilometers from Earth, and it is carrying Bach's counterpoint into the darkness between the stars. The brook has gone a long way from Eisenach.